All right, now we're going to look at something else that you need to know for case writing, and that's how to use real life and historical examples. So within your case, you want to have some sort of, you want to have examples and evidence to support your point. So the purpose of having some kind of example, whether it's a historical example or a current day example, is to support your argument. Now there are three types of examples you can use in your case. And by the way, before I go into the three types, you normally want to put your examples in your contention. So you have an example, maybe one example illustrating each contention. If you have a contention saying, well, free trade leads to prosperity, you might give an example of how free trade led to prosperity in a certain instance. You might give some sort of historical example or a current day example. That's what I mean when we say examples. And they usually go in your contentions, although they can go in other places in your case as well, I guess wherever you feel they're needed. So there are a few types of examples. The first type of example is the hypothetical example. The hypothetical example. This example is basically you make an example up. You say hypothetically that there were two children and one children wanted to do something and then this happened and blah, blah, blah. You make up some sort of hypothetical scenario and use that to prove your point. You can use a hypothetical example. You can use an analogy. Analogies over here, and that's actually the weakest form of support. Analogies aren't super convincing because we don't have proof that your analogy actually applies to the situation you're saying it applies to. So analogy is not the strongest form of support. Analogies aren't very useful for proving things. They're more useful for showing how things work when we already know that something is true. So analogies generally are the weakest form of support. Now what you really want to use are real world examples. You definitely need some real world examples in your case. Now of course, since LD is logical and is a philosophical debate, your argument should be backed up with logic, not just examples. In fact, some LDers don't even use examples. They use pure logic, which is perfectly fine because LD is a logical philosophical debate. But I find that it's better to supplement your case and your ideas with examples to show that your logic is true. Because LD concepts, even though they're philosophical, they do affect the real world. And we can look at the real world through real world examples to see whether our logic and philosophy proves itself to be true in actuality. Because if our argumentation in LD doesn't apply to the real world, it has no merit. If it doesn't apply to the real world, then what's the point of arguing these things and coming to these conclusions if they aren't true in the real world that we live in our reality? So that's why it's important and it's good to have real world examples. Now, it's important, this is very important, the examples are not your main arguments. The examples are not your main arguments in LD. LD is not about examples and it's not about evidence. LD is about logic and philosophy. So examples are not central to LD. They should not be central. But they are useful to demonstrate that your logic is valid and that it plays out in the real world. So you do want to use current events and historical examples. And you can also use some hypothetical examples. And if you want, you can use an analogy. But really, don't use an analogy for a really important thing because that's better proved through real-world examples. Analogies don't always prove that something is true. They just prove that if you can prove with a real-world example or something else that that something is true, then an analogy it can be useful for demonstrating how something could be true or how something would work, but it doesn't always demonstrate that something does work the way you're saying it does. So analogies are not always the best to use. A word of warning though with examples, you need to be careful because there's this little saying called correlation is not causation. Correlation is not causation. What this means is, this is a fancy way of saying just because two things happen doesn't mean that they're related to each other, doesn't mean that there's a cause and effect example. For example, I might say, I ate waffles for breakfast and it rained today. Therefore, me eating waffles caused it to rain, and I could use that as an example in my case. But we all know this is not true. Eating waffles did not cause the rain. So correlation is not causation. Just because two things happen doesn't mean they're related. Now, sometimes things are related though, and those are the examples you use. For example, you could say, well, France embraced free trade and then they got more prosperity. If you can prove that the prosperity was a cause of free trade and that it wasn't correlation is not causation, but correlation was causation, those kind of examples where it is true that prosperity in France increased because of free trade, those are the examples you use. Quotes are also very useful. I had to write it up here because I ran out of space, but quotes are very useful too. We're going to talk about this more in the introduction section when we talk about writing the hook and the intro for our case, but you can use quotes from credible sources to also demonstrate your points. And they're not super convincing, but they do help and they lend you credibility and they make you sound really awesome. So using some quotes can be beneficial. And of course, they do have some credibility. A great quote website to use is brainyquote.com. I added a link in the LMS on the course website. Brainyquote.com is this quote website. You type in keywords, it brings you quotes from all these famous people, and then you can Google them and see who they are, and then you can put the quotes in your case. I use it all the time in my cases. All my quotes basically came from brainyquote.com except for maybe one. And quotes are useful because they show that other people think the same way you do, and it lends credibility because other famous people who are experts believe in what you think. Of course, you do want to use the quotes in context, not out of context, and find some kind of expert in the field. Like, don't quote your dad unless he's an expert, unless he's the president or something like that. Don't quote your little brother, things like that. Judges don't, those quotes don't have any credibility. Now, going back to the real world examples, and really to all examples, try not to use extreme or ridiculous or super radical examples in your case. And the reason for this is that extreme examples are really unconvincing and they're not good argumentation. So an example of what I mean by an extreme example would be me saying, patriotism is bad. Take the example of Hitler. He was patriotic and as a result he killed Jews. That's a very extreme example. It's not a reasonable example of patriotism. This example doesn't really show that patriotism is bad. It isn't really convincing for that point because this is an extreme example. It was an exception, a really radical exception. The whole example is almost a little ridiculous because it's so extreme. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use examples of something going wrong. You should have examples of your opponent's side of the resolution going poorly or ending in disaster or something like that. You should do that. You should have examples of bad things happening. Just don't make them too extreme. Just use common sense and make sure it's not ridiculous, the example that you're using, because it's so extreme. There are a couple common examples that you should always try to avoid. Number one is Hitler. Everybody in LD uses Hitler to the point where people have become sick and tired of it, and Hitler is really extreme. So don't use Hitler because people hate when people use Hitler in debate rounds. Another extreme example, North Korea. Don't use the example of North Korea in debate rounds. Again, people have overused it, and it isn't a good example because North Korea. They're really an exception, and it's a really extreme example, and using that in a round is not very persuasive or convincing. So don't use these kinds of extreme examples. All right, now whatever kind of evidence you use, unless it's hypothetical or analogy, but if you use a real-world example or if you use quotes, unless what you're saying is common knowledge, you have to cite all the evidence you use. So if you reference a news article for your real-world example saying how prosperity increased in France because of free trade, you have to cite that news article. If you quote Abraham Lincoln, you have to cite it and say you quoted Abraham Lincoln. You don't have to cite stuff everyone knows. Like if you say in your case, the sky is blue, you don't have to have a citation for where you got the information that the sky is blue. Common knowledge, you don't need a citation for in LD. But everything else, everything specific, you want to have a citation for your evidence. You also want to have the parts of the article that you used printed out on a piece of paper along with the citations and bring it to the round with you, because there will be instances where people will ask you to see your evidence. They'll ask, hey, can I see that article about the France prosperity thing? And they're going to ask and expect to see it. And if you don't have it, you could get in trouble. So you need to have all that in the round. And you need to make citations in your case. So for example, in your case where you bring up that example with France, you might add a little, a footnote and then a citation at the bottom. NCFCA isn't very strict as to what kind of citation you use. I use Chicago. You can use whatever you want. There's a link to a citation generator that I've included on the class website. You can enter the information on the article there. It'll spit out a citation, and then you put that in the footnotes. If you don't know how to do that, ask a parent. If you don't know what I'm talking about, ask a parent. They'll be able to explain this for you. It's pretty common citations, and they're not too strict about it. They're kind of loosey-goosey, but you just need to have some kind of citation and at least the link of the article where you got the information. They need to be able to find it at a tournament. Okay, another thing with real-world examples, you want to make sure you use good, credible sources. You can't just grab information from whatever website, because the internet does have plenty of websites with wrong information. A great example of this is Wikipedia. Don't ever use Wikipedia in a round. Never, ever use Wikipedia in a round. Because, as we all know, Wikipedia can be edited by anyone, and this means there can be a lot of misinformation on Wikipedia. In fact, for all we know, someone filled the article with incorrect garbage, or even you could have gone in, changed the article to make it say whatever you wanted to say, and then grabbed that and said, look, Wikipedia supports my position, when really you wrote the article, or you changed the article right before you printed it out to make it say what you wanted to say. And that's why Wikipedia is really bad. And if you use Wikipedia, you are going to get slammed. So don't use Wikipedia. Stick with credible sources. Make sure all your sources are credible and you don't take evidence out of context or anything, because there are rules about that. Make sure, just use your common sense and make sure you're playing by the rules. So again, your examples will probably go in your contentions. They'll illustrate the contentions to prove that your contentions are true. And you definitely want some real world examples. Just go on Google and search for whatever you're looking for. So go ahead and you can start brainstorming for some examples. Maybe you can use, go into step 8 in the handout I gave you. And remember, this is just an outline. You may not be able to think of examples right now. You might have to do a Google search for them. That's fine. If you want, you can skip this step and do it a little later. But anyway, this is step 8 in the handout for whenever you decide to do it. So that's it for the section on examples. And then the next section, we're going to look at preparing the hook and introduction to your case. So I will see you then.